Rain fell in thin silver threads over Chicago as a man in a faded blue maintenance uniform pushed a supply cart across the polished granite lobby of Halverson Aerospace Systems, a company valued at well over $20 billion. No one imagined that the quiet man wiping fingerprints off the revolving doors was the only living heir to the empire climbing 70 floors above his head. When the young CEO, Talia Halvorson, later reviewed a security recording of that same man reviving a satellite guidance prototype worth $11 million in under 5 minutes, she did not feel relief. She felt threatened. Within the hour, she ordered him removed for operating beyond the limits of his position. By the end of that single day, the entire leadership floor would fall silent as the woman who founded the company stepped out of an elevator and asked one question that ended Talia's career as she had built it. The morning had begun like every other morning that winter, gray and biting. With commuters hunched against the wind as they crossed Wacker Drive toward the steel and glass tower that housed Halverson Aerospace Systems. Elias Cade arrived 2 hours before dawn as he always did, badge clipped to his collar, his face forgettable beneath a plain navy cap. He greeted the guard at the freight entrance with a short nod and nothing more. Nobody on the facility's crew knew his surname carried any weight in this city. He loaded his cart with supplies, checked his route sheet, and moved toward the North Tower without a word, the way he had for the past 5 months since he first walked through those doors as an anonymous employee of an outside contracting firm. Nobody on the 51st floor spoke to him either. Engineers in tailored jackets stepped around him as though he were part of the architecture, now and then letting a careless remark slip about the smell of disinfectant or the nuisance of a cart parked in a doorway. Elias never reacted. He had learned across many years of building and losing and rebuilding a life he had chosen for himself that silence taught him more about people than any conversation ever could. He watched engineers trade blame over slipping deadlines. He watched young analysts stiffen whenever a certain name was spoken. He watched directors accept praise for work they had never touched. And every evening when the towers of glass emptied out, he wrote nothing down, because everything he needed to remember, he already understood. That particular morning, a junior engineer named Marcus Dell was scrambling to align an experimental guidance module before an investor demonstration scheduled for later in the day. His hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep, and in his rush, he keyed a bypass command that sent the module's gimbal arm slamming into a titanium mounting frame. Sparks leapt from the coupling, and the unit folded into a tangle of bent alloy and flashing fault codes, a device worth $11 million reduced to wreckage in less than 4 seconds. Marcus went the color of the concrete beneath his boots. He knew what a mistake like this could cost him. Not only in dollars, but in the career he had spent a decade assembling. Elias happened to be polishing the corridor outside the lab. When the crash rang through the glass partitions, he leaned his mop against the cart, walked in without asking permission, and crouched beside the fallen unit as though he had done this 1,000 times before. He studied the exposed harness for perhaps 80 seconds, said nothing, then drew a slim tool roll from a pouch at his belt that no maintenance worker should ever have needed to carry. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the stranger in the blue uniform rerouted a scorched relay, restored 3 alignment presets, and coaxed the module back into position within 5 minutes flat, its status light settling into a steady, healthy green. Then Elias stood, gathered his mop, and walked away before Marcus could even manage a thank you. The security footage reached Talia Halvorson's desk less than an hour later, forwarded by an anxious junior manager who assumed she would be pleased that catastrophe had been averted ahead of the investor demonstration. Talia watched the footage twice, her jaw tightening with each replay. She saw brilliance in those 5 minutes, yes. But she saw something else too. Something that unsettled her far more than a broken prototype ever could. She saw a man who did not belong in that room, moving as though he owned every room in the building. Talia Halvorson had fought her way to the top of a company built by someone else's genius, and she had learned that control was the only currency that mattered. She snapped her laptop shut and buzzed her assistant. "Get me the name of the maintenance worker on camera 9, North Tower, 51st floor, she said, her voice flat and cold. "And get someone from Human Resources up here immediately. A member of the facility's staff just put his hands inside a restricted engineering unit without authorization, and I want him in front of me before lunch." Priya Nair, the head of Human Resources, arrived at Talia's office already uneasy, because something about the request felt disproportionate to the offense. A broken machine had been repaired for free, and somehow that had become an emergency. Priya pulled the employee file before making the call, and what she found gave her pause. A background so plain it seemed almost deliberately vague. No notable education listed, no prior references beyond a staffing agency, Nothing that explained how a cleaning contractor understood inertial guidance well enough to repair equipment that had baffled certified engineers. For most of the morning, she said none of this to Talia. She simply placed the call and waited for the man named Elias Cade to appear. He arrived precisely 8 minutes later, uniform still on, cap in his hand. His expression as calm as a man walking into a routine appointment rather than a reprimand. Talia stood behind her desk, arms crossed, the skyline gray and rain-streaked behind her through floor-to-ceiling glass. "You were not authorized to touch that unit," she said without introduction. "Do you understand what could have happened if you had made things worse? We could be looking at a lawsuit, an investor walking away, millions in damages, and all because a member of the facility's staff decided he knew better than a team of licensed engineers." Elias met her eyes without flinching and without apology in his voice. "I saw that it could be fixed," he said simply. "So I fixed it." The 5 words landed strangely in the room. Too calm, too certain of themselves for a man in a maintenance uniform standing before the chief executive of a Fortune 100 company. Talia felt something prickle at the back of her neck. An instinct she usually trusted, telling her this was not a simple matter of an employee overstepping his role. Garrett Vance, the company's chief operating officer, happened to be waiting outside for an unrelated meeting and stepped in uninvited, sensing a chance to appear useful in front of the woman whose favor he had spent years cultivating. "This is exactly the kind of thing that erodes structure," Garrett said smoothly, addressing Talia as though Elias were not standing 3 feet away. "If facility staff believe they can operate outside their job description, what happens to accountability across every department?" Priya Nair watched the exchange with a growing discomfort she could not name. There was something in the way Elias carried himself, an unbothered stillness that reminded her more of a man observing an experiment than a worker facing punishment. She had processed hundreds of disciplinary meetings across her years in human resources, and never once had she seen someone absorb a scolding from a Fortune 100 chief executive with the composure of someone reviewing a weather forecast. Talia, however, read that same composure as insolence. And insolence was something she refused to tolerate from anyone below her, regardless of how the story might end. "Consider this your only warning," Talia said, straightening the cuff of her blazer as though closing a chapter already decided in her mind. "You will not enter restricted engineering areas again. You will not touch company equipment outside your designated duties. And if this happens a second time, your contract with this company will be terminated immediately. No exceptions and no further conversation." Elias simply nodded, thanked her for her time in a tone that gave away nothing, and walked out of the office with his cap still in his hand, leaving Talia and Garrett with the distinct and irritating sense that the wrong person had just left the room feeling like the winner. What neither Talia nor Garrett could have known, and what only a handful of people on Earth understood, was that Elias Cade was not simply an employee who had wandered into the wrong lab at the wrong time. He was the only son of Margaret Halvorson, the woman who had built this entire empire from a single navigation patent more than 40 years earlier. And he had walked away from the family business decades ago after finishing his degree at MIT, choosing instead a quieter life built around integrity rather than inheritance. Margaret had officially stepped back from daily operations 3 years prior, handing the reins to Talia in a highly publicized announcement that made her one of the youngest chief executives in the industry's history. But officially and actually were 2 very different things where Margaret Halvorson was concerned. And she had asked her son for one favor before she would ever consider the company's future settled. "I need to know if the people running my company still remember what it means to be human," Margaret had told him over dinner one quiet evening, her voice steady despite the years pressing on her frame. "Not on paper, not in a press release, in practice, when nobody is watching and nothing is at stake for them." Elias had resisted at first, uninterested in games of corporate observation dressed up as a maternal request. But something in his mother's eyes convinced him this was not vanity or nostalgia. It was fear. The quiet fear of a woman who suspected the empire she had built might already be rotting from the inside. And so he agreed to disappear into the very bottom of the organizational chart to see the truth for himself. For 5 months, Elias lived in a modest studio apartment on the south side, drove a sedan older than some of the interns he passed in the parking garage, and carried nothing that hinted at the fortune waiting for him should he ever choose to claim it. He watched directors humiliate subordinates in rooms they assumed were private. He watched executives inflate travel budgets while lecturing junior staff about discipline. He watched, more than anything, how people treated those they believed could offer them nothing in return, because Margaret had always told him that character revealed itself most honestly in the presence of those with no power to punish or reward it. Elias had grown up watching his mother build something extraordinary from nothing, sleeping on a folding cot in her first cramped workshop in Michigan, soldering prototype boards with her own 2 hands, long before anyone believed a woman could carry an aerospace company into defense contracts worth billions. He had absorbed, almost by accident, the very engineering instincts that later confounded certified professionals decades younger, even though he had spent most of his adult life deliberately walking away from any claim to the fortune Margaret had built. After finishing his degree at MIT, he told his mother plainly that he had no interest in boardrooms or headlines, that he wanted a life measured by decency rather than dividends. And Margaret, though disappointed at the time, had never once tried to force his hand. It was only years later, after her health began to falter and questions of succession grew too loud to ignore, that she asked him for the one favor she had never asked before. Garrett Vance, uneasy after the incident in the lab, ordered a quiet background check on the mysterious worker who repaired million-dollar machines and spoke to chief executives without a trace of fear in his voice. The results came back frustratingly thin. A work history that seemed to begin only a handful of years earlier, references that led to dead ends, no online presence, nothing that explained the calm intelligence radiating off a man who was supposedly paid a fraction of what any engineer in that building earned. Garrett began to suspect something far more dangerous than a rule-breaking employee. He suspected a corporate spy planted by a rival firm to gather intelligence on Halverson Aerospace's unreleased guidance systems and defense contracts. And that suspicion, wrong as it was, would soon set in motion a chain of decisions no one in that boardroom could take back. Talia, meanwhile, had larger problems occupying her attention than a single worker with unexplained talents. The board had been pressuring her for months to tighten quarterly margins ahead of a major defense contract renewal, and she decided the fastest, cleanest solution was to cut costs across what she considered the company's least essential departments. She called an emergency meeting with Billionaire Heir and outlined a plan to eliminate nearly a third of the facilities and support staff, replacing them with an outsourced overnight service that promised the same coverage for far less money. Priya argued against it immediately, pointing out that morale among the remaining staff would suffer, and that the savings were marginal compared with the disruption. But Talia had already made up her mind before the meeting began. "These are not decisions I enjoy making," Talia said, though her tone suggested she had already stopped thinking about it. "But a company this size cannot afford sentiment when the numbers demand discipline. Send the termination notices by the end of the week." When Priya pointed out that the list included the same worker from the incident report, the one who had repaired the guidance module and drawn Garrett's suspicion, Talia did not hesitate. If anything, she seemed relieved to have a clean procedural reason to remove someone who had unsettled her without ever raising his voice. Elias received his termination notice on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a nervous junior staffer who could not meet his eyes as she handed him the envelope. He read it once, folded it neatly, and signed the acknowledgement form without a single word of protest, though Priya, who happened to be passing through the break room at that exact moment, thought she saw something flicker behind his calm expression, not anger, but something closer to quiet disappointment. The look of a man confirming a suspicion he had hoped would prove false. "I hope you won't come to regret this," he said simply, folding the notice into his jacket pocket. And Talia, informed of the exchange secondhand, only laughed under her breath at what she assumed was an empty threat from a man with nothing left to threaten her with. The consequences began exactly 9 days later. And they began quietly, the way real disasters often do before they become undeniable. A batch of autonomous survey drones bound for a major logistics client malfunctioned during final testing, their navigation systems looping into the same error pattern Elias had quietly corrected months earlier without anyone in engineering ever realizing a problem existed in the first place. Then a data server supporting 3 separate defense contracts crashed overnight, corrupting a portion of unsensed files and forcing an emergency call with a government liaison who did not appreciate surprises of that magnitude. Clients who had trusted Halverson Aerospace with billion-dollar partnerships began asking pointed questions that no one on the leadership floor could answer with confidence. Talia summoned every department head into the boardroom, her composure fraying at the edges for the first time since taking the corner office. Garrett, sensing the shifting winds, began quietly distancing himself from decisions he had championed only weeks earlier, redirecting blame toward the engineering team with the practiced ease of a man who had survived many storms by making sure someone else got wet first. "This is a technical failure, not a leadership failure," Garrett insisted, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story to anyone paying close attention. The engineering team, for their part, insisted the systems had been stable for months, and none of them could explain why problems long thought resolved were suddenly resurfacing all at once. By the second week, the crisis had grown teeth. A major logistics partner threatened to pull a contract worth over $500 million unless the company could guarantee stability within 10 days, and a government liaison overseeing the defense partnership quietly warned that any further security lapse would trigger a formal review of the entire relationship. Reporters who covered the aerospace sector began asking pointed questions about leadership stability at Halvorsen Aerospace, and shares slid nearly 7% over a single trading session, rattling board members who had spent years watching the stock climb without interruption. Talia found herself fielding calls late into the night from investors demanding explanations she did not have, each conversation chipping away further at the confident authority she had once worn as easily as her tailored blazers. Engineers worked through weekends trying to trace the failures to their root causes, poring over code and hardware logs until exhaustion blurred into frustration. Yet every fix seemed only to reveal another layer of instability beneath it. What none of them understood, and what Priya alone was beginning to suspect, was that the company's systems had quietly depended for months on a level of invisible maintenance no official process had ever tracked or credited to anyone at all. It was Priya who finally noticed the pattern no one else had considered, reviewing maintenance logs late one evening long after the rest of the floor had emptied out. She cross-referenced the malfunction reports against the quiet notes she had kept from the earlier incident, and a chill moved through her as the timeline aligned with uncomfortable precision. Every failure now crippling the company traced back to a system that had been silently and invisibly stabilized by the very man they had fired for daring to touch a broken machine. She brought her findings to Talia the next morning, laying out the evidence with the clinical detachment of someone who already knew how unwelcome the conclusion would be. Talia stared at the report for a long moment, the pieces refusing to fit neatly into the narrative she had built in her mind about discipline and structure and the dangers of employees who forgot their place. For the first time since the worker had walked out of her office with his cap in his hand, she asked a question she had never bothered to ask before. Who exactly was that man? She said quietly. And Priya, watching the color drain slowly from her employer's face, understood that the question had come far too late to undo what was already set in motion. 3 days later, a black sedan pulled up outside the Halvorsen Aerospace Tower, and an elderly woman in a plain wool coat stepped out without an entourage, without cameras, and without a single member of the staff recognizing the face that had once graced the cover of every major business magazine in the country. Margaret Halvorsen moved through her own lobby like a stranger, unnoticed by the young receptionists who had never worked at the company during her active years at the helm. She rode the elevator to the leadership floor, and let herself into a small conference room adjoining Talia's office, where she waited in silence, listening through the thin wall as Talia recounted her recent triumphs to a visiting board member with the practiced confidence of someone unaware that her audience had just doubled. I streamlined the facilities and support staff last month, Talia was saying, pride evident in every syllable. Cut unnecessary overhead, tightened the whole operation. We eliminated positions that were frankly dead weight on this company's balance sheet. Margaret listened without moving, her expression unreadable, until the board member excused himself and Talia's office fell quiet enough for Margaret to finally step through the connecting door. Talia startled, recognition flooding her face a half-second too late. The way it does when someone realizes the person standing before them is far more important than their casual entrance suggested. Mrs. Halvorsen, Talia said, rising quickly, smoothing her blazer, her voice climbing an octave in surprised deference. I wasn't told you were visiting today. Margaret waved off the pleasantry with a small, tired gesture, settling into a chair without waiting for an invitation, her eyes studying Talia the way a jeweler studies a stone before deciding whether it holds any real value beneath the polish. Tell me about this facility's staff you eliminated, Margaret said, her voice soft but carrying an edge Talia had never heard from her before. Tell me specifically about the man who cleaned the 51st floor. Talia hesitated, sensing danger without understanding its source. He was a contractor, talented in some unconventional ways, but he crossed lines regarding authorized access, and I made the decision to let him go along with several others as part of a cost restructuring. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, her silence stretching until it felt heavier than any shouted accusation could have been. Then she rose from her chair, straightened her coat, and delivered 4 words that would haunt Talia for the rest of the week. Call the board together, Margaret said. Tonight. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 that evening. 12 directors gathered around the long glass table with the particular tension of people summoned without explanation by a woman they had assumed retired for good. Talia took her usual seat at the head of the table, still believing, against every instinct now screaming otherwise, that this meeting existed to celebrate her cost-cutting initiatives rather than to unravel them. She opened with a brief, confident summary of the quarter's efficiency gains, gesturing toward projected savings on the screen behind her, unaware that Margaret had already connected a laptop to the room's display system and was simply waiting for her to finish. "Thank you, Talia," Margaret said once the younger woman had settled back into her chair, her tone pleasant in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than anger would have. "Before we discuss the quarter, I'd like to show the board something I've been reviewing over the past several days." She pressed a key, and the screen filled with security footage time-stamped across 5 months, showing the same man in a blue uniform moving quietly through server rooms, engineering labs, and production floors long after most employees had gone home for the night. The room watched in silence as the footage cycled through dozens of small, invisible interventions. A corrupted server rerouted before anyone noticed the corruption. A defective assembly line halted moments before it would have shipped faulty parts to a defense client. A pressurization test rig recalibrated after a fault that would have triggered a costly recall the following week. No one in the room spoke as the montage continued, each clip more damning than the last in its quiet demonstration of competence that far exceeded any job title listed on the man's employment file. Garrett felt sweat gather at his collar, calculating rapidly how much of this had happened directly under decisions he himself had championed. Talia's confident posture had collapsed entirely by the 3rd minute, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though the floor itself might give way beneath her. When the footage finally ended, Margaret closed the laptop gently and looked around the table with the calm, terrible patience of a woman who had been right about something painful for a very long time. "That man's name is Elias Cade," Margaret said into the silence. "He has, for 5 months, quietly prevented no fewer than 8 catastrophic failures that would have cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars and very possibly our government contracts entirely." She paused, letting the number settle over the room like a physical weight. "You just terminated the employment of my son, the sole heir to this company, and the only person in this building who understood exactly how fragile everything you've built truly is." The silence that followed was the kind that seemed to press against the walls of the room itself. Garrett's face had gone the color of old paper, his mind racing through every conversation he had used to nudge Talia toward decisions that served his own ambitions rather than the company's health. Talia sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, searching for words that refused to arrive. The carefully constructed image of her own competence crumbling in real time before 12 of the most powerful people in the industry. One director finally broke the silence, asking the question every person in the room was thinking but too stunned to voice aloud. "Where is he now?" the director asked. And Margaret, rising from her chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had waited a long time for this moment, answered simply, "Ask him yourself." The doors to the boardroom opened, and Elias Cade walked in wearing a tailored charcoal suit instead of a maintenance uniform. His presence utterly transformed, and yet somehow exactly the same. The same unhurried calm, the same steady eyes that had unsettled Talia from the very first conversation in her office. Legal counsel followed a step behind him, carrying a folder that would soon confirm what Margaret had already announced, that Elias held 41% ownership in Halverson Aerospace, a veto right over major board decisions, and standing as the sole named heir to the company's controlling trust. Talia stared at him as though seeing a stranger for the first time, though of course she had seen this exact man dozens of times, simply never seen him at all. "Mr. Cade," one board member said, half rising from his seat out of pure instinct, and Elias gestured gently for everyone to remain seated, taking the empty chair beside his mother rather than the head of the table that was technically his to claim. Talia found her voice at last, though it came out thinner than she intended. "I had no idea," she started, and Elias held up a hand, not unkindly, but with enough quiet authority that she stopped mid-sentence. "I know," he said. "That was rather the point of the uniform." Garrett attempted a defense, some tangled explanation about protocol and structure, and the necessity of maintaining boundaries within an organization this size. But his words unraveled further with every sentence, especially once legal counsel produced records of expense manipulations and internal communications showing that Garrett had spent months positioning himself as indispensable while quietly undermining several colleagues to secure his own advancement. Margaret watched her old company's chief operating officer dig his own grave with visible, if weary, satisfaction. By the time the board voted to remove Garrett from his position entirely, effective immediately, he barely protested, some part of him seeming almost relieved that the performance was finally over. Talia, once the board's attention shifted back toward her, rose from her seat with the stiff dignity of someone preparing to accept the inevitable. "I'll submit my resignation by morning," she said quietly, addressing Margaret rather than Elias, as though she still could not fully process that the quiet man beside her held more power over her future than anyone else in the room. Elias spoke before his mother could respond, his tone even but carrying an unmistakable weight. "That won't be necessary," he said. And the room, already stunned once that evening, found itself stunned again. "I have a question for you first," Elias continued, turning to face Talia directly for the first time since entering the room. "If I truly had been nothing more than a maintenance worker, the man you believed me to be for 5 months, would you have treated me any differently than you did?" Talia opened her mouth and closed it again, the question landing somewhere far more uncomfortable than any accusation could have reached. She thought of every dismissive glance she had allowed herself, every assumption she had made about a man's worth based entirely on the uniform he wore rather than the mind operating beneath it. And she found she could not answer honestly without condemning herself completely. "No," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, the single syllable costing her more than any resignation letter ever could. "I wouldn't have." Elias nodded slowly, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to quiet sadness, as though her honesty confirmed exactly the fear his mother had carried into this experiment from its very beginning. "That's the problem," he said. "Not that you fired a maintenance worker. That you would have treated any maintenance worker exactly the same way, and never once questioned whether that was right." Garrett, already stripped of his title and gathering the last of his composure before being escorted from the building, muttered something bitter about how power always finds a way to protect itself. But no one in the room bothered to respond to him anymore. Talia, tears finally breaking free after holding them back through sheer force of will, asked the question that had been building in her chest since the moment the footage first appeared on the screen. "What happens to me now?" she asked, and the room waited, uncertain whether mercy or ruin was about to follow. "A single mistake does not define an entire life," Elias said, and something in his voice suggested this was not simply a lesson he was teaching her, but one he had learned himself somewhere along a difficult road of his own. "You made decisions rooted in fear and pride rather than understanding, and those decisions cost this company dearly. But I did not walk these hallways in a uniform for 5 months just to watch you lose everything over it. I did it to find out whether the people leading my mother's company were capable of change when confronted with the truth about themselves." Talia wiped her eyes, uncertain whether she deserved the chance being offered to her, and Margaret, watching her son with quiet pride from across the table, said nothing at all, letting the moment belong entirely to him. In the weeks that followed, Elias did not seize the chief executive title for himself, though the board and his mother both expected him to. Instead, he proposed something that struck several directors as unconventional, bordering on reckless. A mandatory rotation program requiring every senior executive, beginning with Talia herself, to spend 1 full month working directly alongside the company's lowest paid roles before advancing to any leadership position. Going forward, executives would clean floors, staff the front desk, serve meals in the company cafeteria, and stand guard at the loading docks, not as punishment, but as a permanent reminder of the human infrastructure holding up everything the glass tower represented. Several board members balked at first, calling it inefficient, even embarrassing for a company of this stature, but Elias held firm, and Margaret, who had waited decades to see her company confront this exact blind spot, backed him without hesitation. Talia volunteered to be the first executive through the program, though volunteer was perhaps too generous a word for a decision made with little real alternative available to her. She spent 4 weeks mopping the very floors Elias had once cleaned, serving coffee to employees who had once feared crossing her path in a hallway, and standing at the loading dock in the cold morning air, learning firsthand how differently the world treated a person once the title disappeared from her badge. She came to understand, slowly and sometimes painfully, the quiet dignity Elias had carried through every dismissive glance and every careless comment directed his way during his own months of invisibility. By the end of the program, something in her had shifted permanently, a hardness worn away by weeks of standing where she had once refused to look. One afternoon, during her 3rd week, while sweeping the same stretch of hallway where she had once confronted Elias over the broken machine, Talia recognized a face among the passing engineers, and realized it belonged to Marcus Dell, the young man whose panic had set off the very crisis that eventually unraveled her career. He offered her a cup of coffee from the break room without a trace of resentment, and the small kindness of the gesture struck her harder than any boardroom reprimand ever could have. She found herself apologizing quietly, not for any single decision, but for an entire way of seeing people that she had never before questioned. And Marcus, surprised but gracious, simply told her that everyone eventually learns the same lesson. Some just get to learn it before it costs them everything. By the final week of her rotation, Talia had stopped counting the days until it would end. She began arriving early, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine curiosity about the small rhythms of a life she had spent years walking past without seeing. The exact moment the loading dock grew busiest, The particular care with which the overnight cleaning crew treated equipment they were never even trained to operate. When the program officially concluded, several of her former colleagues expected her to shed the experience like an ill-fitting costume the moment she returned to her office. But instead she asked Priya to make the rotation permanent policy for every incoming executive, herself included, on an annual basis going forward. Marcus Dell, the young engineer whose trembling hands had triggered the very first crisis in that opening week, found himself unexpectedly promoted to lead a new division focused on preventive maintenance. A role that existed specifically because Elias had insisted the company needed people who noticed problems quietly long before they became expensive disasters. Marcus often told newer hires that the strangest and most valuable lesson of his career had come not from a professor or a mentor, but from watching a maintenance worker solve in 5 minutes what his entire team had failed to understand in 5 hours. He kept framed above his desk a photograph of the very module Elias had once repaired, less as a trophy and more as a quiet reminder of how easily talent could be overlooked when it arrived in an unexpected uniform. Priya Nair, promoted to oversee a newly created Office of Workplace Culture, built an entire framework around the principle Elias had insisted upon from the very beginning, that no employee's contribution should ever be measured solely by their title or their salary. Complaint lines that once gathered dust began filling with genuine feedback, addressed promptly rather than filed away and forgotten. Managers who had once ruled through fear found themselves retrained or replaced entirely, and for the first time in the company's long history, turnover among entry-level staff dropped to numbers the board had never imagined possible. Word spread slowly at first, then quickly through industry circles, that Halverson Aerospace had become something rare among corporations of its size, a place where the person who fixed a broken machine and the person who approved its budget stood on genuinely equal footing. Nearly a year after that fateful board meeting, national business publications began ranking Halverson Aerospace among the finest places in the country to build a career, citing its unusual rotation program and its transparent culture as evidence that a company's soul could survive even after decades of prioritizing results above everything else. Talia, restored to her position as chief executive but forever changed by the lessons of that single winter, led the company with a humility that surprised even her harshest former critics within the industry. She and Elias built a working partnership grounded not in hierarchy but in mutual respect, each understanding now what the other had needed to learn the hard way. That competence without character eventually collapses under its own weight, and that character without opportunity never gets the chance to prove itself at all. Elias accepted the position of chairman of the board, a title he had resisted for most of his adult life, though he insisted on keeping a small office on a lower floor rather than the executive suite that had once belonged unofficially to him by birthright. He still occasionally walked the halls in simple clothes, greeting security guards and cafeteria staff by name, a habit that some newer employees found strange until they learned the story behind it, passed quietly from one generation of workers to the next like a piece of institutional folklore that happened to be entirely true. He never spoke of his months undercover as some grand act of heroism, preferring instead to describe it as the only honest way he had ever found to understand the people whose labor made his mother's empire possible in the first place. Margaret, watching the transformation of her company from the quiet comfort of her retirement, allowed herself a rare moment of visible pride one evening as she stood at the window of her Vermont home, looking out over grounds she had built with the same hands that once assembled the company's very first patent decades earlier. A visiting reporter, granted a rare interview to mark the anniversary of the company's cultural reforms, asked her the question so many had wondered since news of the scandal had first leaked into public awareness. "Why test your own son this way?" the reporter asked, "when you could have simply asked him to take over and trusted the truth of who he was?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering, her eyes still fixed on the distant lights of the town where her legacy continued to breathe and grow beyond her direct control. "I never needed to find the richest possible heir for this company," Margaret said finally, her voice soft but certain, carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent an entire lifetime separating truth from performance. "I needed to find someone who would still kneel down to clean up a mess quietly, without needing anyone to see it, long before he ever stood at the very top of the world, looking down on everyone beneath him." The reporter wrote the words down exactly as spoken, and they would go on to appear in nearly every retelling of the story that followed in the years afterward, quoted in leadership seminars and printed on the walls of the very cafeteria where Talia had once served coffee to the people she had almost destroyed without ever learning their names. A title, after all, can make people fear you long before they ever choose to respect you, and fear fades the moment power shifts away from the one who holds it. But the kind of respect built through humility, through the willingness to kneel down and fix what is broken without demanding recognition for it, tends to outlast every title a person could ever claim. Because it was never built on power in the first place. It was built on something far more difficult to fake and far harder to lose once it has genuinely been earned.